Well, good morning. My name is John Jackson. I am the president of William Jessup University. I want to thank all of you for joining us. From a housekeeping perspective, all webinar viewers are muted, but if you have questions and you would like to ask a question of a presenter, please submit it using the Q&A button that's at the webinar toolbar. If we're unable to get to all the questions, we'll work to follow them up after the webinar. We'll also be sending a follow-up survey with a link to a recording of the program. Now I'm pleased to introduce Kaina Pereira. He's the Deputy Director of GO-Biz. Kaina oversees all business investment and permit assistance services at the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. He has a strong background in real estate development and finance and has been a significant partner to GSEC. And so we're just so grateful that you've joined us today. So Kaina, I want to turn it over to you at this time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jackson. I really appreciate those kind words. As you said, I'm just really pleased at the partnership that we have with the Greater Sacramento Economic Group, our council, and have been really thankful for their collaboration with GO-Biz in elevating the Greater Sacramento market and area. I know that the leadership there is very strong, and we work hand in hand with them and are eager to promote this region as one of the fastest growing regions in the state. So thank you very much. And I know that there's a lot of clamor for economic updates and what GO-Biz is doing during these times. So I'll give some brief updates from my perspective about some of the projects that I've been working on and a lot of the different tools that we hope to be able to come to fruition as this budget then changes and as this really unprecedented time really takes shape. So as the Deputy Director for the California Business Investment Services Unit, as well as the Office of Permit Assistance, and now recently the International Affairs and Trade Team, I oversee all of the business assistant programs for the state of California, and that includes site selection service. And so happy to see that Chris Lloyd is here and had the pleasure of meeting him earlier and doing one of the site selection summits that GSEC put on a couple months back. So I know that there's a lot of clamoring for what are we going to do after everything calms down and we're going more into recovery mode. And I just want to say that, our group here is standing ready to assist any company on any issue to try and make sure that we can put our workforce back to work and continue the expansion that we've experienced over the last decade. I know that the first step is flattening the curve, and that has been done very well. I appreciate the leadership of our governor. I'd also like to say that we also have another curve to flatten, and that's in relation to unemployment. And so a measure that has been done in partnership and collaboration with some of our external folk and third-party vendors, such as Bitwise, has put together onwardcalifornia.org, onwardca.org, which is an avenue for identification of resources and tools for individuals to get training necessary and upskilling necessary to find the next job and the next opportunity, whether it be in what is currently a high demand area such as delivery services and healthcare workers, but also to have a perpetual influx of new jobs as they come online, especially in relation to the manufacturing pivot that a lot of our state manufacturers are considering. So as we put people back to work, we're also going to be looking at all the programs that are available in the state with a keen eye towards recovery and a keen eye towards maximizing the benefit for California companies. So that being said, I think that there's a lot to come, and I'm just happy to be here. I really thank you, Dr. Jackson and the GSEC team, and would like to turn it back over to Dr. Jackson to introduce Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you so much, Kaina. We so appreciate the partnership we have. I know all of us are affected by the coronavirus, of course, and we're thinking about other states. We're thinking about all that's happening around the globe, but particularly grateful again to be here in California. I think it's easy occasionally to be negative on California, but we are not negative on California. We're pro-California, and we're particularly pro the Greater Sacramento region. The Greater Sacramento Area Economic Council has just been a tremendous part of the community. And I've lived here about 10 years, and it's radically shifted the way our community operates. And I'm excited about that and excited to be part of it. It's my privilege to now introduce you to Christopher Lloyd. He is with McGuire Woods Consulting. And Chris, we're very excited to hear from you and to get your insights about what's happening in the Sacramento region. And so we look forward to hearing your presentation now. Welcome, Chris.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Again, this is Chris Lloyd from Garwood's Consulting in Richmond. It's good to be visiting with many of you again. I really enjoyed the tour that I had along with some of the other members of the Site Selectors Guild and other site selectors back in November. It was a great experience, and I was reflecting on this the other day, and I thought it would be a good opportunity. What I did was reached out to a lot of the communities that I toured last year and said, hey, if you'd like to have the opportunity to kind of talk about what the site selection community is hearing and thinking as a result of the current crisis, I would love to do that. And so that's when I reached out to Barry and Danielle, and that was the genesis of this. So really appreciate y'all making the time, and just wanted to again express my thanks for all the hospitality that was shown to me during that tour. So what I was going to walk through were a couple of areas. The Site Selectors Guild had a group call, an all hands call on Monday, just to compare notes as to what we're hearing around the country, as to what sectors are up, what sectors are down, what we're hearing from our clients as far as where we see opportunities emerging when this all ends. But I thought I'd first start off with talking a little bit about a conversation that I had with Stephen Murray. Stephen's the head of Virginia Economic Development Partnership here in Virginia, which is where I'm located, in fact, just right across the street from us. And I've been involved in Virginia policy and politics for 20 plus years. In economic development, I've been the policy chairman for our state economic developers association for 21 years for free. And so care a lot about economic development policy, and was talking to Stephen. Really the genesis of it was reached out to him and said, Stephen, it's not too early to start thinking about, a gubernatorial created economic recovery commission. I know that we need to be sensitive to what's going on, and we need to be working with our small businesses, particularly those in the hospitality community, and get them through this. But we also need to make sure that we're all focused as an economic development community on kind of what comes next. And there's going to be a lot of pressures from a number of forces and sectors coming out of this to deal with some of the problems that this epidemic has caused. And if the economic development community doesn't start to use this time now to start thinking about what's next, it's going to be to our detriment, and it would be good for the economic development community to step forward. And I thought I really wanted Stephen's opinions on that and how Virginia would prepare, because Stephen in his previous life had a pretty searing experience, and that is he got to live through Katrina, because he was the economic development director in Louisiana when that hit, or just right afterwards, working for Governor Jindal at the time. And most of the economists compare the COVID pandemic and the economic impacts of that is more akin to a natural disaster than a structural or a cyclical recession or depression. That it obviously comes on very suddenly, results in massive unemployment, massive dislocation. But as soon as the situation passes, yes, there's going to be pain, but typically the economy restarts back up. Obviously, this is much deeper and different from anything this country's ever dealt with. But still, I think there are some analogies. And Stephen said that he remembers two things that were particularly lessons that came out of the Katrina example. And one was, he said, they realized that, whether this was Louisiana or whatever, that the challenges and opportunities that Louisiana faced going into before Katrina were the exact same ones coming out, that it put those issues, those challenges, or those opportunities just on steroids. It didn't result in really fundamental changes in the economy, in the structure of the economy. It just took, if you already had a problem with tort reform, you already had a problem with tax issues, that was just made worse. Or if you already had some opportunities with a certain sector, those were enhanced. That competitive advantage was enhanced because of the natural disaster. The second thing he noted was that he thought they made a strategic mistake in Louisiana, in that they expected the tax revenues to fall off very suddenly after the hurricane. And so the legislature and the governor came in with a meat cleaver and just started whacking away at government programs, and took $1 billion out of the state budget, which for Louisiana is a lot of money. And he said that they realized that was a mistake. That instead, the right thing to do, because then you just added to the woes, because you had taken that kind of money out, and that they really, what they should have done was kind of hit pause for a few months, understand that, yeah, you probably need to make some adjustments in the short term, but really long-term tax revenues came in not good, but better than everybody feared. And that maybe if you just kind of hit pause in state and local budgets for some time, that maybe the problem won't be as bad as you think. So I share that with you all for what it's worth. When we had our site selectors call the other day, a lot of the comments that I heard from my colleagues around the country, and actually a number of them in Europe, reflected kind of what we're seeing in our business. And that is that activity level remains strong. I just put out an RFI for a industrial projects focused on the Midwest. I just put that out last Monday. None of our projects in core industrial have industrial or distribution have slowed down. The only area we've seen some softness is we do a lot in the hospitality world. And several of those projects were office projects or call center or support service for the hospitality industry have obviously been put on hold. The hospitality industry, hotel, restaurant, right now they're fighting for survival. And so those projects have been put on hold, but logistics remains extremely strong. And you're seeing that whether it's e-commerce or anything regarding warehouse and distribution remains extremely strong. The only weakness that we're seeing across the country is obviously at our ports. Some of you may have seen LA reported last week that quarterly traffic for the first quarter was down 30% compared to the first quarter of 2019. But they attributed just as much of that to the trade dispute with China as they did the economic slowdown. You're seeing that in the East Coast ports as well, as that the international traffic is slower, but the domestic traffic on truck and rail remains very, very strong. So anything associated with logistics and warehousing, they're barely able to keep up. Food and beverage manufacturing also remains very, very strong around the country. Most of those plants are having a hard time keeping up. Some of them are having to adapt. If you're in the produce market, that's a tough market right now. What one of my colleagues said is that what they have found is that as people have gone into shelter at home, is they're starting to eat like college frat boys. So they're eating a lot of junk food, and they're not eating, fresh fruits and produce. And so produce is challenged right now, but that packaged foods, prepackaged foods are extremely strong, and the manufacturing facilities for those are as busy as they've ever been, if not busier. And that then flows through because people are buying more groceries, stocking up, cooking at home. People forget that I hear 40 to 45% of all meals in America are served at a restaurant, whether it's takeout or eat in or delivery. And so when you suddenly have closed all the restaurants, you've got a huge demand for food. So you're seeing a lot of people that were servicing the restaurant and the hospitality community are making conversions to the consumer market. And so that's creating a lot of opportunities. They also think that this is going to be the thing that finally causes e-commerce in the grocery space to take off. That groceries have been the last sector to really embrace e-commerce. It was only a little bit out there. And that now people are going to get much more comfortable with e-commerce, having their groceries selected for them and delivered. In order to make that happen, you're going to need, America was already lacking in cold storage space, and you're going to need, regional cold storage facilities as well as localized cold storage so that, these kind of grocery products can be stored. And I think there's some economic development opportunities there. Kind of what's down, what we were hearing is obviously restaurant and hospitality are very weak. A lot of people think that we could lose probably half of the restaurants that existed before we went into this. Fast food and fast casual is probably going to be okay. Those that had a strong drive-through or delivery model are going to probably bounce back just fine. Fine dining is going to be very, very challenged, particularly table service restaurants, unless they were part of a larger restaurant group or had a long-term sustainable plan, are going to be very challenged. And hospitality as well. The big chains are going to be okay at that level, but people forget the big chains don't own a lot of the hotels. In fact, virtually none of the hotels. So a lot of the franchisees who run the actual properties are very heavily leveraged. And if they're not getting cash flow in, you're going to see some real challenges. Brick and mortar retail obviously is going to be one of the big losers from this. That's no surprise for, I think, most people. I remember telling my wife after Christmas that if we had any returns to make to Macy's, go ahead and make them, because I wasn't sure Macy's would be around in 2021. I think this is going to just exacerbate or accelerate the demise of some of those retailers that are already on the edge, whether it be Gap or Nordstrom, Gap. Nordstrom's actually relatively well capitalized. Gap, GameStop. This might be the demise of Kmart and Sears. Macy's, some of those other chains that were already starting to struggle, Bed Bath & Beyond, were already starting to struggle a little bit. This might be what puts them out or accelerates their demise. We then kind of talked a little bit about it as a group where we saw some of the emerging opportunities coming out of the recovery. One was cold storage was the first one. Data centers what we're doing today requires a data center to host all of this. And the data center world is still very, very strong. And I think it's only going to get stronger as we come out of this. So the opportunities are there. And then people believe that there is an opportunity that, we realized that so much of our pharmaceutical and medical supply was being supplied from overseas. And some of the statistics I've heard is that 90% of the base pharmaceuticals used in the United States are made in China. And, you think about I don't think as a world, we're going to let that happen again. And particularly as a nation, we're not going to let that happen again. And, the opportunity that might exist for reshoring that into the United States to some degree, if not all manufacturing, but at least certainly storage and finished products of pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, we all thought was going to be a pretty big opportunity. The only other things that we talked about, or we thought that this whole exercise was going to do or provide was, there were already trends that were emerging in the economy, which we think this will speed, one of which was the demise of brick and mortar and the acceleration of e-commerce. The other ones were, we think, artificial intelligence and, automation will continue to grow as a result of this. And so again, you're seeing these things that were already starting to happen in the economy and transform the way we do economic development and site selection in this country, that this, we think, will only accelerate some of those trends. With that, I'd be glad to turn it over to the next speaker, and we can talk about some other categories through the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. That certainly raised some huge issues. That also raised some questions from me. So I will, as well as other participants, can put your questions in the Q&A section in the webinar, the chat function there. We'd love to receive those questions. We'll do our best to respond.
Great.
Next, I'm pleased to introduce another Chris, Dr. Christopher Thornburg. He founded Beacon Economics, LLC in 2006. Under his leadership, the firm has become one of the most respected research organizations in California, serving public and private sector clients across the United States. In 2015, Dr. Thornburg also became director of the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, and he's also an adjunct professor at the school. Dr. Thornburg was kind enough to join a recent GSEC Board of Directors meeting to offer his perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, and we're thankful that he was willing to make time to participate in this call as well. Dr. Thornburg, welcome again to GSEC, Greater Sacramento Area Economic Council, and welcome to this call. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? I just, sorry, I checked in a little late. I missed the early part of the conversation. I was on yet another Zoom meeting. This is the new world we're in, right?
Right, you're doing great.
But yes, so I talked a little bit about the economy, and the reason we're talking about the economy is, of course, the conventional wisdom out there right now, at least driven by these screaming headlines, is that what's happening in our economy is going to be long lasting. In fact, anybody who's been paying attention has probably heard any number of groups out there say this is going to be worse than the Great Recession. A lot of major banks are forecasting the economy to not heal until really the end of next year. So we're talking about a truly long run downturn. Now, Beacon Economics, there are a couple of things. First of all, there's no doubt that what's happening today is unprecedented. But as much as this is unprecedented and a little bit scary and a lot of unknown territory, as the case may be, we aren't as quick as other folks are to simply say that this is going to be a Great Recession type scenario. Start with just the basic idea of employment, because right now, the only real metric outside of the anecdotes of being able to go out on the highway and drive around rush hour at 80 miles an hour, which is very odd. Beyond that, the only real metric we have, of course, is what's happening in terms of those employment numbers. And that is truly stark. I mean, right now, in the last 3 weeks, we now have more people on unemployment insurance than we did at the peak of the Great Recession. Truly startling, but this is not a Great Recession type scenario. You know, back then, the problems in the labor market started with the collapse of the subprime bubble. And the subprime bubble, of course, was the 15 trillion in subprime lending and all the auxiliary borrowing that went on in the financial system that happened between 2001 and 2007. That massive amount of money flowing into the economy created massive imbalances in housing, in consumer finance, in consumer spending, and of course in the financial sector itself. You know, that couldn't last. And when everything started to fall apart, and really at the end of 06, early 07, it was not only a function of time before, of course, the economy fell into a recession, but we lost millions of jobs in construction, finance, and real estate permanently. The result of that permanent loss of jobs was that those millions of workers had reduced wages for years, which in turn had a secondary shock on the US economy. It was a truly, truly tough time to get through. And it took 6 quarters to get out of the recession. It took 4 years for labor markets to actually get back to normal levels of unemployment and employment. Very ugly. This time around, it's a completely different circumstance. The job losses we're seeing is not being pushed by, of course, some fundamental problem in our economy, an imploding bubble, a collapse in demand from one part of the economy. Rather, this is completely driven by public health mandates that are designed to get this virus under control. Now, the key here is to understand that these numbers themselves are not actual economic damage. We can all agree if we came up with a miracle cure for this virus tomorrow, the vast majority of these people will be back at work on Monday. Now, it isn't to say this isn't harmful, because we're not going to be able to turn this off next week. This is going to take a minimum, probably a month and a half more of total shutdown to get this virus truly under control. And in the meantime, workers aren't getting income and businesses aren't getting income. And over time, that lack of income will create secondary problems in supply chains, in financial markets, in rental markets. These issues, as they build, will eventually start to create long-run harm that will cause the recovery to be quite slow. So in other words, we're not saying this isn't going to be bad, but it doesn't have to be bad. What really this all depends on, the amount of harm, the slowness of recovery is going to be driven by 3 major things. How long and how wide is this shutdown? Of course, what is the government going to do? And last but not least, how healthy the economy was when this shock hit in the first place. Now, the good news is, let's go through these 3 things. One is we're pretty sure that this isn't going to last more than another 6 to 7 weeks. We have data coming out of China and Korea that says as long as we're tough, we're resolute, we do what public health officials tell us to do, we're going to be able to get through this. In terms of what the government's doing, well, there you're talking about a $2 trillion package just from the federal government. Let's not include the couple trillion that the Federal Reserve is going to start pumping into the economy. This is over the top. To put it in context, let's just talk about what the federal government $2 trillion program. $600 billion of that is going directly to American consumers in terms of expanded unemployment insurance, as well as, of course, just direct payments to households. That's largely equivalent to the amount of income Americans are probably going to lose in the second quarter of this particular year. They have hundreds of billions of dollars in loans to small businesses, direct supports to things like airlines and other industries that are important for national security. So this is really amazing how much this is going to help give a lift over the next few weeks and prevent the harm happening now from becoming long-run damage to the economy. Last but not least, we have to remember this shock hit the system, of course, during one of the healthiest, fundamentally healthiest periods in the last 30 years. Now, I realize that's not what the press is telling you, but you take a look at the numbers. Debt to income, financial obligations ratio, the savings rate. American households are in the best position they've been in 30 years in terms of money built up and backdrops. And really, the fact that essentials such as housing as a percent of people's income is the cheapest it's been in a decade. This is not a fragile consumer sector. In the financial markets, there hasn't been a lot of buildup in debt. In fact, private sector debt to GDP has been falling for the last decade. If you look at the commercial loan markets, delinquencies are at all-time low records, not fragile financial markets. They just aren't. So really, when you think about the fact that this is a strong economy, it's a resilient economy, we have phenomenal amount of public intervention, I am pretty comfortable that, of course, second quarter historic negative on an annualized rate, probably something on the order of 20 to 25% reduction in GDP, followed, however, by a 20% bounce in GDP in the third quarter. And really, by the end of the year, almost whole again. Will we even call it a recession? It's hard to say. One quarter does not a recession make, but that's academic. The point here is the long run harm doesn't seem to be that acute. And there's no reason, given what we're doing right now, that we shouldn't have a good, strong bounce back that will erase much of the harm, and we'll be back on track in 2021. This is not the Great Recession. Now, there are wild cards out there. Will there be another round of virus? What was going to happen in terms of the global framework? Because, you know, other countries such as India don't have the capacity to deal with this the way we do. We don't know. Will people come back? Will there be any kind of permanent change in consumer behavior when this thing comes to an end? Again, we don't know. There are a lot of uncertainty out there. And we all have to be careful. We have to move forward. But don't panic. Don't think this is going to be a massive end to this particular economic expansion. There's a lot of potential outcomes. And if we work together, if we do the right things, if we listen to the health professionals and do what they're telling us, there's no reason in the world that this shouldn't be very painful in the short run, but with a very rapid recovery behind it and getting back to normal much quicker than most people are expecting.
Wow, that was very helpful. Thank you both, Chris's. I've personally been thinking about not just flattening the curve, but breaking the curve and doing some historical research. And I'm no economist, but doing some historical research, I really trust that we'll see that 20% recovery that you talked about in the third quarter. I actually am contending for that. So what we want to do now is open up for questions and answers. Danielle Casey with the GSEC team is going to help facilitate. So Danielle, let me turn it over to you. You'll do Q&A, and then I'll add some closing thoughts at the end. Thank you, Danielle.
Wonderful. Thank you all so very much. What a wonderful panel. And I'm also extremely excited to see all the participants, more than 70 folks online with us right now. So very exciting. I have a couple of questions that have come in either on chat or Q&A. So I'm going to just read those off and let our panelists attack them. And I will remind everyone, if you'd like to submit a question, please go down to that Q&A button on your toolbar and just go ahead and type it in, and then we'll walk through this. So the first one I have was submitted by Wendy Nelson. She's with Market One Builders here in Greater Sacramento, and she's asking of Chris Lloyd, what best practices are you seeing in economic development groups around the country in response to COVID?
Sure. One of which I referred to when I spoke, and that is even just this week, I've started to see the first group starting to think about recovery. And that is putting, you know, the framework into place for bringing together a brain trust to think about what recovery looks like and how you position for that. Second, the other ones that I've seen are is people really starting to think about talent. And that was actually a big issue or big topic that we had on our Site Selectors Guild call was, you know, we've all in economic development talking about the importance of talent for the past few years. And people are saying, well, if unemployment is going to skyrocket to 12 or 15%, is talent dead? Because you're going to have so many people unemployed. And all of us said resoundingly no. That, yeah, there's certainly going to be a larger pool of workers in the short term. But, you know, with these, again, these big trends in the economy regarding artificial intelligence, automation, we think international trade is going to remain strong. International travel is going to remain strong. The globally connected world is here. And people who are talented and who have skills, who can be flexible, that talent's going to continue to be sought after. And so, you know, doubling down on you know, a talent investment and understanding what the talent is within your community is absolutely vitally important. If you haven't done so, this is a great time to relook at your strategic plan as an economic development organization. I'm seeing some organizations just starting to think about that and saying, hey, the plans even we had 6 months ago, are they still valid? Are some of the assumptions still valid? Again, we as site selectors feel that many of the trends, and I think Dr. Thornburg reiterated this, that, you know, we're going to come out of this pretty strong, but there may be some reorientation around the edges and taking advantage of some of those sector opportunities that I talked about. So brushing off that strategic plan, brushing off that marketing plan, We're starting to see some really good activities around that. All that is on top of, I think, just some, every economic developer I've talked to said they've never been busier in their lives. Just fielding all the calls and questions they're getting of how do I fill out the federal form? What can the state and local government do to assist me, with regards to liquidity issues, putting on these kind of webinars and other informational resources. I had been spending the last 5 years going around the country talking about the war on economic development and about how, I think there was the political left and political right were after economic development. I actually think this is a moment for the economic development community to shine, because I think people are going to really realize that it's the economic development community that's going to help businesses resurge and come back to life. And so if we can start positioning ourselves to take advantage of that as we recover, I think the profession will be well served by it. So those are some of the best practices I'm seeing, Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I know we are going to have a few minutes at the very end of this when we do closing remarks for our CEO, Barry Broom, to touch on some things. And I know he'll probably maybe provide some high level insights because we are, what's great to know being in this is that Greater Sacramento is mobilizing in the way that you just advised. So we're very excited. I'm going to go to a question from the chat that Councilman Alvord from Roseville submitted. He said, because the vast majority of jobs are attached to small business, I'm curious how the speakers think the government aid packages will realistically help them. I work with small business owners and there isn't much faith among many of them that the money will come through because the banks don't seem serious about helping. Do either of you have any insights? And maybe we'll bounce to Dr. Thornburg first on this one.
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate the frustration. Look, you don't roll out a $2 trillion package in a week and a half without, shall we say, a few of the details being left in the dark. And certainly this small business loan program, the Paycheck Protection Program, is one of those programs they're still trying to figure out on the fly. This is about $500 billion, and it may end up being ultimate $500 billion plus in monies that small business should be allowed to borrow through their banks. And they can use that basically to stay liquid over the course of the next couple months. I think it's very important. Now, I appreciate that it's not going out quite as fast as you might like. But with that in mind, that's mainly, I think, a logistical situation. A lot of banks use electronic systems, and they need to understand the rules, they understand the regulations in order to get it programmed in appropriately in order to be able to get those loans out. And a lot of them, because every minute the rules change, are just not able to keep up with the rule changes. Federal government needs to figure out how this is going to work, get the process in place. And you know what? It's okay if it doesn't happen in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Look, businesses across California, really in much of the United States, are being allowed to forego certain expenses. You don't have to pay your utilities. You don't have to pay your rent at this particular point in time. You're able to avoid some of those expenses without really any kind of fear of long-run consequence and focus on some core things like paying your employees and keeping the business operating. As long as you get that check at some point in time over the course of the next month, you can use that money to pay towards some of those build-up deferred expenses, and it will go ahead and help quite a bit in terms, again, that stability of the overall process. So take heart, let the process play out, and remember, the system isn't that fragile. It's really easy to think that, boy, one shock and, the economy is like a giant piece of glass. You hit it hard with a hammer, it just falls into bits. It's not. People mitigate. They have systems, they have ways, they figure out ways around problems as long as they know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Very few businesses are going to get up and walk away if they think that in 2 months or 3 months, they can be back and doing exactly what they were doing in January and December prior to the pandemic.
Danielle, this is Chris. The only other thing that I would add is I certainly agree with Dr. Thornburg's views. And I think, next week is when, most people are going to start to see this federal supplement coming into the federal supplemental unemployment insurance checks are going to start arriving. The stimulus checks are supposed to start arriving next week in people's pay, in their direct deposit accounts. probably the economic development or the economic disaster loans, the $10,000 ones will start hitting. So, I mean, I really think this time next Friday and the week after, you're going to see a big shift in sentiment out there that, you know, once people start to see the money showing up in their bank accounts and all, you're going to, and obviously hope that we're going to be in a much better situation with regards to infections and whatnot, that you're going to start to see that turn in confidence that was alluded to earlier.
Danielle,
Yeah, and I'd like to add something really quick too, because the state of California through the iBank program has also stepped up to offer some assistance, especially to small businesses, those who may not qualify for the SBA style loans or some of the other more difficult to achieve ones. And that program is standing up as we speak. It has been funded to the tune of around $50 million. And those are going to be short-term, really long duration type of opportunities capped at a certain amount. So a lot of the details are coming out. But, you know, if you go to business.ca.gov, the information will be provided through the iBank network, ibank.ca.gov also.
I'd like to just quickly add, I think we're going to see American ingenuity and creativity on display like never before. And as both Chris's indicated, you're going to see restaurants who go into self-serve and delivery like never before. You're going to see home-based manufacturing go crazy. We're going to see businesses adjusting and shifting their model. So I put my confidence and faith, not just in the American consumer, but in the American business community. I think small businesses are actually going to soar. They're the backbone of the American economy. And Scott, I appreciate all you're doing in your local community and the way that you've led. And I think local communities are actually going to soar in the Sacramento region.
All right. I am thrilled because I'm getting a lot of great questions. And as a reminder to everyone, if there are any that we're not able to answer, we're going to see if our panelists will be so gracious enough after the fact to answer some that we can share with people. I am getting several questions related to the banking question, but so that we also make sure to use this time to get our national perspective, I'm going to hop back to one and then we'll go back to some of the banking. How does the panel think that California will fare compared to the rest of the country? And then, you know, greater Sacramento. And I had this question earlier with Chris Lloyd also on kind of, you know, what regions are we the most concerned about? So if you want to kind of tackle both those questions in one, maybe start with Chris Lloyd.
Sure. You know, California's lucky to have a very diversified economy. You know, we were having a call among our own colleagues this morning, and our office in Tallahassee checked in. Florida is really going to be hurt. You know, they got a tourism-driven economy with their whole tax structure driven by sales tax receipts based on people coming in and cruise ships coming in. And Florida is going to be really hit. You know, a lot of the coastal communities on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast are going to be hit hard by this. I think California is going to be pretty okay. You know, you haven't had, you know, you haven't had the breakout, the hot spots as New York or Detroit or New Orleans have had. I mean, obviously there have been issues in some of the urban areas, but certainly the concentration in the big urban areas in California has not been what you've seen in other parts of the country. And I think it's going to be okay. Sacramento, again, I talk about, you know, this is what we learned about on the trip. You know, there are a lot of good trends moving Sacramento's way. And again, I think that the economy, when it comes back, it's just those trends are just going to accelerate. But obviously, I'd like to hear Kaina's and Dr. Thornburg's perspective on that as well. Although so
I have to run actually right now. There's another webinar that I have to go to, but I do want to especially touch on this question in particular. One of the interesting things in dealing with the crisis as it is just the tremendous outpouring of support and offers for assistance from our manufacturing community and some of those in what is deemed a non-essential space, and how they're willing to pivot to try and meet this moment for all Californians as well. And so that's one of the things that I think he was talking about, is the innovation and the ingenuity of our business owners and of our populace and of our workforce to be able to do those kinds of things is really putting us in an opportunity where we can take something good out of what is a difficult time and build a stronger foundation. So I do think that our resiliency in this area in particular and in the state in particular is going to actually propel much faster than expected in some degree. And thank you very much. I have to run right now. Sorry about that, but thank you all for the time.
Thank you. Dr. Thornburg.
Just quick, you know, we don't have to kind of reiterate. I do think California will probably do better than many other places. We were very aggressive about getting out in front of this, more so, I think, than a lot of places. And the value of that is showing up in terms of our getting a handle on this, not having the overrun hospitals that are so indicative of a place like New York. That's very good. Clearly, we have a very high-end workforce in the state. Most of those folks are going to continue to move forward. I will, however, point out, I think, two areas we as a state have to worry about. The first area, of course, has to do with tourism. No doubt, California is a highly tourism-driven state. A lot of local governments rely on tourism for a lot of their local dollars, and that's clearly going to have some ripple effect through the economy, as tourism will probably be one of those lagging indicators, something to think about. And the other thing to think about is California does really have a lot of low-skilled workers. A lot of those are even undocumented. And we know these folks don't have the same access to some of these social safety net programs that are being made available to those who are documented or are American citizens. And we have to worry about that large population as well. They just don't have, if you will, the same support to get through the next few weeks that other folks do. So there are some issues in California, but overall, I really give a big hand to many officials at the state level, at the local level, who made tough, dramatic decisions early, and have really, I think, created a situation by which California can yet again be a shining example for the rest of the nation.
Excellent, thank you. I have a question from Sarah Worley in the city of Davis. Any advice to local governments who are trying to make sales tax projections for 2020 quarter 3 and 4 and onward, so they can assess potential impacts on local government budgets and funding?
Well, obviously, find a good forecasting operation and hire them. That would be my first statement. But beyond the basics of promotion there, it's a tough time to do forecasting. There's no doubt about it. And I think that all cities should be hoping for the best but preparing for the worst. You should be thinking about a substantial short-run disruption to revenues. And that's something that you need to have the lending facilities to make sure you can weather that particular storm. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to be made whole in terms of lost revenues in the second quarter of this particular year, which could be quite stark. Now, again, I don't think it's going to last long in the system. There's going to be a nice bounce back in terms of activity in the second half of the year, but it won't be enough, again, to make up for those losses in the second quarter. The good news is the government, federal government, is making, of course, some assistance available even to local governments. And for local governments that need to go ahead and rely on short-term borrowing markets, well, again, the Federal Reserve is out there working like crazy to stabilize the short-term lending markets, which yet again should help short-run governments deal with some sort of short-run revenue shortfall.
Great. Chris, did you have any comments there at this time?
Nope, I think the Economist is better positioned than me to say. Oh, then I do go back to my comment earlier. It's just, the experience from Louisiana and I think other states is, the third quarter could probably be rough, and particularly communities that are heavily dependent upon tourism or hospitality or restaurant-related revenues are going to be hit hard. But again, I go back to the point of, particularly looking at restaurants. 45% of the meals in America are served by a restaurant. Yes, we're going to probably lose a significant number of restaurants, unfortunately, through this, but that demand is still going to be out there. I don't think everybody's going to, that is a trend that was already going on, and you're going to see new entrants into the market, and that revenue is going to recover pretty quickly.
Absolutely, Chris. I do have a question, and it looks like you answered it on the Q&A, but I thought it would be great to share with everybody. No, this is wonderful. We had a question on, do you see the long-term effect on the low-wage worker from this pandemic being that they may get left behind even further, and then we have a larger homeless population to contend with?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure if you were going to bring that up or not. So, that trend was already out there, in that the low-wage worker was already being left behind in the economy, and we already had issues to deal with making sure that they could pivot and get marketable skills. yeah, I mean, you know, there's going to be a larger pool of people competing, at least in the short term, for those, for any job that's out there, particularly those that were adversely impacted in the hospitality and the restaurant field. So I think that is going to hurt people who are marginal workers. And so, you know, again, now is the time to be starting to think about, you know, retraining and credentialing programs to get those people so that they have marketable skills so they're not left behind as the economy continues to change.
I would weigh in just briefly on that too. And while I certainly appreciate that at some level, I think we also have to remember that we entered this crisis with a record tight labor market. 3.5% unemployment, lowest in 50 years. For the last 2 years prior to the pandemic, there were more job openings in the US than there were people looking for work. So we entered into this problem with a labor scarcity issue in the US. And, you know, that's something to keep in mind because yes, there's going to be some job losses, but a lot of companies were already scrambling, trying to find workers in the first place. Yet again, that's the kind of circumstance that provides, I think, a lot of resiliency here than, say, had this pandemic hit 7 years ago when we were still in the midst of that long-term painful recovery from the Great Recession.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, I've got about 3 more minutes here. So I'm going to tee up one last question, and then I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Jackson, who's also going to give a couple minutes for our CEO, Barry Broom, to maybe provide some closing thoughts and comments so we can finish right on time. I will tell everyone we are working on some future webcasts regarding they're going to be a little bit more focused on the banking side and helping businesses with those questions. But we've had a few questions quickly, if it's in your area to comment on. As small businesses, we've had several people reaching out that have applied for PPP. There's just a lot of general worry that the funds are going to run out. Is there enough for everybody? Do we know anybody that's had funding come through? So if this is anything that you're able to comment on, and on top of that, how are regions adding capacity to their banking community in terms of SBA loans? Are you seeing any best practices out there in California or nationally?
Chris, I'm going to leave that for you.
Sure, I'll start. You know, I think Congress and the Fed will eventually step in, and if there's any gap, that they'll fill it, that they'll provide additional capacity in the system. I know there is a concern that, you know, that the big, more sophisticated companies are going to swoop in and suck up the capacity of that program. I don't know that that's going to happen as much as people fear it's going to. And I think if there's a gap, I mean, there's already, right before I got on this call, the Washington Post just put up that they really think, you know, Congress is going to have another deal ready by next week. And so I think if there's any gap, I mean, the Federal Reserve, the fiscal stimulus, I mean, it's whatever it takes right now. And they're, as Dr. Thornburg talked earlier, might be a little bit slower than we all would like, and you got to get systems in place to make it happen, but eventually I think it'll be there. Dr. Thornburg?
Yeah, no, I agree more with that. In fact, I would even go to the next step, which is, I mean, really, a degree of government intervention right now is almost too much. You know, there are certain parts of these programs I see are completely valuable, but for example, sending every American household, married couple, $2,400, whether or not they're out of work, that gets to the point where you're almost thinking, are we overdoing it a little bit? Is this more about the election year than necessarily this pandemic directly? But better to overdo it than underdo it, certainly. And as already noted, it seems like they're going to just continue to spend to make this thing go away as fast as possible, and ultimately, that will, I think, create a nice bounce in the economy.
All right. Well, thank you both tremendously. My time is up on the Q&A, and I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Jackson and Barry.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I'll keep my comments very brief. I just want to thank both Chris's and Kaina. Thank you for your expertise and the gift that you've made to us and to the Sacramento region. A couple of very quick comments. I always say I'm a leadership guy, so I always say that leaders traffic in hope. But as we know, hope's not a strategy. So I appreciate the comments that were made about low-wage workers. You might be surprised to hear a president of a four-year college say this, but I absolutely think that we need to modify the educational system across the country, and that's being done for us. Modification is happening. I think certificates, credentials, job-ready capacity is going to be so essential because the job market is going to keep shifting. Remember Dr. Thornburg's comments. We were in a very, very tight labor economy, and we've got tremendous opportunities ahead. I really believe that the Sacramento region and the counties have the right resources to weather these storms. That has not always been the case, but thankfully with Greater Sacramento Area Economic Council, with Barry, with Danielle and team, I just think we're really positioned very well, and I'm excited for the future of the Sacramento region, while at the same time being very sensitive to the reality of pain, both in our local area, as state, as well as the nation, as we go through this terrible, terrible circumstance. But on the other side of it, I really believe that we have tremendous opportunity ahead. So Barry, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'll let you close us out, but thank you for everyone for participating in the seminar. And thank you for the experts who provided leadership for us today. Barry?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jackson. I want to thank everybody being on the line. You know, we already have our recovery strategy laid out because from the very beginning, we worked on building market resiliency away from government into future industries and future tradable sectors. So I know I've shared this